July 2nd, 2020, the eve of the Hamilton release. I haven't seen that show, and looking forward to seeing it on Disney. One of the greatest Broadway shows I ever saw was Les Miserables. I think it literally changed my life forever. I was so amazed by it that after seeing it, I decided to go and buy the original book in French and try to read it. And here they are right here in the bookshelf. Three copies. Victor Hugo, Les Miserables. It took him, I think, a dozen years to write. Makes me feel better since it only took me maybe 3 or 4 years to do my book. Another story for today. The chapters deal with a scene in Nashville, and I wrote it almost 5 years ago this weekend. And in fact, it was on my birthday, and I woke up at 4:30 in the morning with the dawn in Virginia, visiting my parents. And I sat down and wrote for a few hours, which became most of this chapter, Down the Rabbit Hole, chapter 49. Doing that, having the discipline to get up that early in the morning and write, and to write what I thought was usable text, usable copy, I knew then I would do this book, I would complete it. I had written some of it before then, but I knew. I didn't have that discipline right after college when I sat down to write a book in Seattle. There were too many distractions. I couldn't do it then. But when I sat down at dawn that day and wrote this chapter. Now, getting back to Victor Hugo. So I like this book so much. Had to read this one, Notre Dame de Paris, better known as The Hunchback of Notre Dame in English. It's a wonderful book. Also very, very long. It's an incredible story. And the end of it is quite touching. If I turn to that page, maybe just read the last sentence. L'homme auquel il avait été donc venu là, il y était mort. Quand on voulut le détacher de ce gant qu'il embrassait, il tomba en poussière. The last line, when they tried to separate from the skeleton that he was embracing, he turned into dust. And it's the name of this chapter, the title of this chapter is Le mariage de Quasimodo, Quasimodo's wedding, when he spent the rest of his life and died next to Esmeralda and held her. All right, well, let's get to the chapter in the book, Down the Rabbit Hole. Chapter 49, Down the Rabbit Hole. Paul scanned the restaurant for the best spot to sit, by a window or a group of diners who seemed friendly, and his eyes were drawn to the long bar, adjacent to the kitchen's prep stations, and as each table had guests, he took a seat at the bar for a cooking lesson. This Nashville joint was clean, open, light, with soft pastel shades to inspire happiness, reminding him of the Wolf's Stomach in London Jane suggested that was so popular. You couldn't get a table without a reservation, but if you were by yourself, you could get a spot at the bar by the cooks after sweet-talking Jo, the hostess, and admiring her tattoos. The staff remembered him as the Bazaar Yank who brought bottles of wine he made himself and were surprised how good it tasted, and he was surprised how good their food was, and realized what was common knowledge for generations. London is a great city. He had missed it most of his life, preferring France, a choice made out of ignorance because he didn't know London, but could speak French. So he went to Paris. Why, if it isn't the artful, dodgy bootlegger himself, said Jo, welcoming Paul with a smile. Have you brought me a bottle of your fab wine? Of course, the Bootleggers Express always delivers. How's your friend Jane? I haven't seen her in a while. Thanks for asking. She's wonderful. and planning a trip to London next month. And how are you, love? Is that a new owl tattoo on your arm? Let's have a look." And he gently lifted her arm for a better look, then kissed the owl between the eyes. "I love owls. Magnificent creatures. They protect our vines from gophers." "Oh, what's a gopher?" "Imagine an ugly hedgehog with teeth as long as an elephant's tusk." "Sounds frightfully dangerous." "Only when you catch them with your bare hands." "Wait a moment," said Joe, dashing off to take care of other guests, and when she returned, Paul presented her with a bottle of Blue Merle wine that earned him a glass of Prosecco from the head waiter and a soft kiss on the cheek from Joe. He sipped standing, admiring her ink. "Thank you so much for the wine. I enjoyed the last bottle. I love your Tempranillo. How's your dog?" "Dead." "So sad. Are you going to get another?" "I was thinking of getting a tattoo of him instead. Just like the label, right here, on my heart." "Brilliant." "Joe, did I ever tell you about my winemaking neighbor back home who's a bit older than you and almost as lovely?" "She got a tattoo right here," said Paul, pointing to his sternum. "Ouch, I could never do that." "You'll never guess the design." "An owl, is it?" "A cougar." "A bloody cougar? I've got to see that." "I'll tell her to visit her when she makes it to London." "Your spot's ready, come on now." And she escorted Paul to a stool at the bar that shared the stage with the chefs, and he watched the cook in charge of the fish station roll a raw bass in white sea salt, turning it into an icy snowball he put on a pan and popped into the flaming gas-fired oven to melt. The bartender sliced blood oranges into a blender with ice and gin. Paul made a mental note to try that at home and ordered 2 glasses of Barolo, one for Jane, because it was their restaurant, although they had never dined there together. She discovered it on a business trip to London and recommended it, and since she couldn't accompany him, he would enjoy going to the same place as her, sit in the same chair, meet Joe, and share the same food and drink. In this way, they became closer, even though they didn't occupy the same place on the planet at the same time, except on the rarest occasions, made possible by unicorn magic. He sat at the counter and toasted Jane, and since she wasn't there, he drank her glass. And like many Londoners that Friday night, staggered home on the streets, because after the Barolos were gone, the wine steward came over and discussed Tempranillo and trends in Italian wines and offered Paul glasses of Barbera and Brunello and Grappa that couldn't be wasted, which he was when he was finished. It was cold, damp, raw January when Paul went to London for Europe's biggest EdTech conference, but now he was in steamy midsummer Tennessee, where women in their 20s, nifty Swifties, each a Marcy, strolled through the newly constructed hipster Gulch section of Nashville, wearing summer dresses of semi-see-through fabric, each dreaming of Taylor, who owned an apartment in the neighborhood. Paul didn't meet Helen Mirren when he dined in London's West End, a block away from where she was performing, but perhaps this was the night he would meet Taylor in Nashville, and she would become the inspiration for a wine, and he the subject of a song. He scanned the restaurant for her, and his eyes were drawn to the flames of the wood, and he felt its heat and watched the cook at the poultry station paint the pale dimpled skin of a plucked bird with olive oil, rub it with sea salt, thyme, and rosemary, then place it into a pan near the flames. The cook shuffled a dozen birds in the oven like a magician who keeps plates spinning on many poles, making sure each bird received the right amount of heat, tanning perfectly brown without overcooking. Paul never ordered entrees in a restaurant he could prepare at home, but was so tempted by the golden fowl the cook removed from the inferno to brush oil over bronze skin, then slid back by the blaze, triggering a flashback of quail fleeing wildfire and the smell of burnt feathers, the savory aroma of roasting chicken, overcoming an unsavory memory. He appreciated the gift of scent, his born-again nose of the resurrection, gifted by the priestess of scent. There she was again, back in his head. I wonder what she's doing. Observing cooks of the line perform their craft with nifty swift slices and chops of serrated sharp blades, his mind hypnotized by flickering flames, wandered from the kitchen of his first job, where he had dodged a meat cleaver, to the London restaurant where seats at the bar bordered the kitchen, and he ordered an extra glass of wine for her, although he was alone. 3 seasons had passed since their last meeting. He had flown to New York in a snowstorm, carrying a case of wine, but she was too tired or too busy, or it just wasn't convenient. Perhaps she had just washed her hair and couldn't do a thing with it. He admired her rumpled, Rapunzel, coyly crinkled locks that were to him so simple, natural, and carefree. He never understood the effort to maintain that style, or when she permed it flat iron straight. Whatever her reason, her excuse, he was disappointed because he wouldn't let a snowstorm stop him from meeting her. The Bootlegger's Express always delivered. He realized what a fool he had been, desiring her, flirting with her, dreaming of her, because as much as nature hates a vacuum, nature abhors a single woman remaining alone. Girls grow up and get married, and men are wasting their time in friendships with women if what they desire is more than friendship. Paul vowed never to email her again, and when he returned home, he shaved his head, unfriended her from Facebook, and gave her up for Lent. What he didn't know is she wanted to see him that evening in New York and make snow angels and snowmen with him in Central Park, but work that week had taken its toll. She was tired, had an important presentation to the executive team the next morning. She needed to stay inside, warm, and rest. If only he had offered to visit her at home. Doesn't the Bootlegger's Express always deliver? Where's my delivery? Watching cooks practice their craft was interesting until loneliness poked through the spell and he wished he was home with the vines. His phone pinged. Are you planning to be in London or Paris next week? It would be nice to see you. A surge of electricity stored in his brain's battery sparked. The light switched on. In an instant, darkness vanished. I was just thinking about you. I'm sitting at a restaurant counter getting a cooking lesson. He texted a photo of the cooks, the golden poultry, the flames. That looks like wolf stomach in London. Exactly. He took a snapshot of the second glass of wine, still full. I ordered this for you, fragrant Viognier. Oh. 30 seconds passed. I'm working in London Monday through Friday, then treating myself to 2 days in Paris. Would you join me? He paused for a moment, then tapped. I've been traveling every week the last 6 weeks. I need to get home and net the vines before birds damage all the fruit. May I have a rain check? He was tethered. If he had been free, he would have flown anywhere in the world to see her at a moment's notice. A day with her could be a lifetime. Or would it be a step to damnation? They met another time in Paris, when both had reasons to go. They walked leisurely along Ile Saint-Louis, cobblestone streets, gazing at ornate buildings, eddies from the river enveloping them in white water noise. They stopped at a sidewalk cafe for a glass, he a Calvados toasting Mary France, she a Provence blush wine, bluey. Resuming their stroll along the Seine behind the Gothic flying buttresses of majesty of Notre Dame, he asked her about the story of the hunchback. Do you remember how it ends? Please remind me. She had seen the Disney version. He had read Hugo's novel in French, a gift from Mary France. Years ago, during excavations to prepare a foundation for taller buildings, a construction crew discovered a mass grave. He took her by the arm and pointed to an empty lot away from the cathedral. Archaeologists determined the site was a burial ground for executed prisoners. As they carefully sifted through the remains, they found a skeleton unlike any other, astonished to find it wrapped around another skeleton so tight they were unable to separate the two. The first skeleton had an unusual spine shaped like an S, a deformed skull, and immense forearm bones. And the Académie Française concluded It was Quasimodo, the hunchback, who, after Esmeralda's execution, snuck into the pit where her corpse had been thrown and embraced her, and there he stayed, holding her, so they would be together for all eternity. How gruesome, yet so touching. When I read Hugo's prose, it sent goosepimples down my spine, such an expression of devotion and love. He pulled from his pocket 2 golden hearts with chains of gold. After I read that, I longed to hold you and never let you go. He lifted one of the gold hearts, saying, "Take your heart," and placed it into her hand, asking her to read the inscription. She raised it to her darker than Esmeralda eyes, reflecting the sparkle of the river's current, and saw her name. He showed her the second heart in his hand, inscribed with his name, then reached into his pocket for a Gucci lock. "Shall we lock our hearts together?" he asked. Yes. He took the heart from her hand and slid it over the lock with his, so their hearts were together. "Pick a spot." She pointed to a gap in the wrought iron fence, with a view of Notre Dame in front of Ile Saint-Louis behind, and the river Seine all around. With the lock open, he hooked the rail and took her hand into his, and the 2 hands made one, closed the clasp, locking their hearts together. The noise of the city evaporated, and time stood still, with the 2 of them in rapture. "Here is the key to our hearts," said Paul, handing her the key, ceding all power to her over their relationship. "Hold me like Quasimodo," she said, "and never let me go." He wrapped his arms around her and embraced her, and for the first time it was a real hug, close, with only the fabric of their clothes separating them, and he could feel her warmth, and she could feel his strength, and he lifted her off the ground to a squeal of delight and brought her feet slowly, gently, back to the bridge, and stared deeply into her cavern eyes and saw a tear, and she saw his soul, and he moved his lips to hers, and before closing his eyes saw them coming, and pulled apart. "Hello, ladies!" Paul called, introducing Jane to Carrie-Anne, Jenny and Steph, who were in Paris to celebrate Steph's 5th anniversary cancer-free. And at that moment, Paul was glad his relationship with Jane was platonic. The moments before a couple's first kiss, an effervescent blend of desire, innocence, hesitation, longing, trepidation, were magical, dreamy, poetic. Whenever Paul and Jane met, they lived in that time spell, he a negatively charged ion rod, she a positively charged magnet, with such force of attraction, the potential energy of a million-mirror solar plant, that only fate, their willpower, and God's will kept their lips from touching and setting off an electric spark that, if unleashed, would rival the crushing of an atom. Their feelings were so stellar, the gods prepared a constellation of stars in the zodiac in their honor, for it had been decades since they had witnessed a force so strong, an attraction so charged, they kept building without discharge. After the first kiss, there could never be another first. So Jane and Paul met and lived in the moment before their first, surrounded by electric currents, magnetic forces, and unfilled desires. With anticipation, they spent precious, joyful time with each other, not daring to cross the line, happy to be in each other's company. Magic surrounded them, Jane seeing a unicorn leading their walks. And had their lips merged? Had he tasted wine from her tongue? Had the sly and subtle grapevine urged Jane to paint lipstick on his smackers with hers? What then? 2 supercharged polar opposites would be struck by the mightiest of electronic bolts, piercing their lips, racing down their spines and out their tingling toes, leaving behind the flesh of two bodies soldered together, fused by that intense release of concentrated damned energy to become one, electrons colliding, atoms fusing, passion, panting, groans, screaming, and then, as they lay side by side in an empty state of exhaustion, AFO, what thoughts would run through the new lovers' heads, the spark between them ignited, spent, gone in a flash? Would their powerful feelings return? Could their batteries be recharged to super strength? Would he travel to her in a snowstorm? Would the unicorn trot alongside the next time they jogged together? Could there ever be another kiss as electrifying as the first? As Paul worried about the aftermath of loving her, oh, the ecstasy and agony of his daydreams, Jane found solace reading the adventures of Alice in Wonderland and teasing him, tempting him, daring him to leap into the rabbit hole, while he, half a continent away, walked through the vineyard in early June, inspecting firm, swelling grapes, imagining them to be her firm, erect nipples, and as he continued walking, he noticed a cluster of Tempranillo, whose Spanish name implies early, exhibiting one grape with a slight pinkish color. Could this be the start of veraison? He walked down the row and saw another grape, unmistakably pink. There it was, veraison, the beginning of the reddening of the grapes, the color of Jane's coral lipstick, which she would apply on her lips one day. He was listening to the grapevines cooing again. It was the pink of the lightest rouge of blushing cheeks, sipping rosado. As he looked at the firm grapes of that cluster, he imagined his tongue licking the pinkish pinnacle around, encircled by the dark areola in the middle of her milk chocolate breast, ever so gently caressing, nibbling, fondling her grapes between his teeth. Then he saw it, a patch of white fuzz, a fungus surrounding the green berry of a cluster, and if it spread, was as dangerous to the vineyard as inflammatory breast cancer. Mildew. He turned towards the house and stepped down the hill and slammed on the brakes of his legs and realized he didn't have his shovel. An adrenaline raced through his body as he thought what to do as the snake coiled and cocked to launch a preemptive first strike.